They will come.
Not yet, at least.
They will come as we come.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us for this session titled An Update on South Africa and Nigeria. I don't have to tell you that they are two of the most significant and biggest economies on the African continent, as respectively they are the most advanced and the largest economies on the continent. My name is Siki Mgabadeli. I'm a financial journalist based here in South Africa, and I'll be facilitating this conversation today. As you know, the IMF predicts that growth in Sub-Saharan Africa will rise to 2.6% in 2017 and 3.5% in 2018. These two economies that we're focusing on today, both South Africa and Nigeria, are predicted to grow this year at 0.8%. And I think most of us would agree that that is sluggish, to be polite, and it's really not going to propel us to the heights that we are looking for. So how did we get here, and where are we going to? That's what my panelists are going to help us understand today. Both countries, as you know, have been through the ringer in recent times, that fall off in commodity prices, currency volatility, some political ructions, and of course the recent downgrades for South Africa have all meant that we're starting from a really negative and I suppose a low base as well, but we're going to get ourselves to a better footing, and we're going to talk a bit about that today. Let me introduce the gentleman on my panel today. Kuseni Dlamini is chairman of Massmart Holding South Africa. He's a former head of Anglo-American South Africa, and he's also a World Economic Forum Young Global Leader. Haruki Hayashi is the Executive Vice President and Regional CEO for Europe and Africa at Mitsubishi. He has more than 30 years' experience in resource development and investment. Danladi Verheijen is the co-founder and CEO of Verod Capital Management in Nigeria, and is also a World Economic Forum Young Global Leader. And Geoffrey Qhena is CEO of the Industrial Development Corporation here in South Africa. He's a chartered accountant, and he has wide-ranging experience, having worked for organizations like Transnet as a senior manager before joining the IDC. Thank you very much to all of you for making the time to talk to us today. I think I've outlined where we are, why we're having this conversation, but I think I want to get a sense from both of you, from all of you, about how we got here and how recent developments in both countries have led to the kind of growth trajectory that we're at right now. Kuseni, I'll start with you.
Thank you very much, Siki. It's a great honor and privilege to be here. This is a very topical subject for us to be discussing on the first day of the World Economic Forum Summit in Africa. These two economic giants we're talking about account for 60% of Sub-Saharan Africa's GDP. And I would like to argue from the outset that in a world that is seeing the globalization project being in a state of flux, Africa needs to get its act together. And I'd like to say that the starting point is for Nigeria and South Africa to get their act together. If Nigeria and South Africa don't get their act together, Africa's chances of getting her act together are likely to be limited at best or non-existent at worst. How did we get to where we are? I think we are inextricably linked with the global economy, and our fortunes, and indeed the fortunes of these two economic giants, are very much tied to the fortunes of the global economy in general. And most recently, of course, China is a huge factor in resource-intense economies such as Nigeria and South Africa. The slowdown in growth in China obviously impacted global commodity prices, and we saw global commodity prices plummeting, which had a huge impact on both economies, especially so on Nigeria. And I think the lesson in the context of what we are talking about, the theme of inclusive growth and responsive and responsible leadership, the lesson for leaders in business and in government is to ask ourselves, have we been responsive enough? Have we been responsible enough in thinking about not just short-term strategies that rely on booms in commodity prices, which we know they are always short-lived, but have we been thinking about medium to long-term strategies that can underpin the growth and development of Nigeria and South Africa, to start with, and by implications, the rest of the continent? I would like to argue that we have not done the right things. The fact that we are where we are, Siki, is because Nigeria and South Africa have not done the right things at the right time to be able to lay the foundations for sustained growth and development. And I think the opportunity now is to learn the lessons from the opportunities that we've missed.
Let me ask a potentially controversial question of you. Why should we care about South Africa and Nigeria? We have many other African giants that are forging ahead, growing their economies faster, that are really tackling the big question of industrialization, reindustrialization, and inclusive growth. Why do South Africa and Nigeria matter?
That's a great question. The answer is in your introduction. They're the two largest and most industrialized economies. And secondly, as I pointed out, they account for 60% of the GDP of Sub-Saharan Africa. And it's inescapable that if Nigeria and South Africa don't succeed, I would like to argue that I challenge anyone in the room to differ with me that the extent to which Africa can succeed, if Nigeria and South Africa don't succeed, is likely to be limited at best or seriously impaired at worst.
Let's hear from Haruki, your opening remarks just on the broader question of where we are and where we're going.
Yes, and I probably, people wonder why the Japanese gentleman is sitting here in between the Nigerian and the South African to start with. I have been associated with Africa for the last 10 years, continuously, and I lived in South Africa 4 years. And also, I served on previous Nigerian government international advisory board for 3 years. Of course, that doesn't justify me speaking here, but one thing I have two nations in common is the two nations can be a leader, driver, and role model, and at the same time being very healthy competitor in the continent. I think there is a size and scale for the market, and there's a quality in terms of service sector, and there's a huge diaspora talents outside of the country. And in terms of education, it's building. So I think all of this will make it happen that there will be a larger chance of two competing each other to grow intra-Africa trade. And there is a local and regional production to service the local and regional society and people. And technology is also taking place in these two countries. But what we need is, of course, a role of the government, sustainable policies, governance, and long-term perspectives, and stay away from corruptions, and regional integration, and once again, education. And I think all this, the two nations can lead to make it sustainable.
Just picking up on the role of the government, I'd like to get a sense from you on what role you think that is, because often for investors, governments can either be obstacles to decision-making, to quick decision-making and capital deployment that investors want to embark upon, or they can be real partners and assist. What's that role in the two countries been like in your experience?
We're not here to be commenting on the politics, but what I can tell you probably is the consistency and probably a stability of the running of the policy once it's been implemented. That will certainly attract a lot of foreign investors to continue to be involved.
So that predictability,
yes,
more than anything else. All right, your opening remarks.
Thank you very much, and it's an honor to be here. I'll speak most about Nigeria because that's what I know the best. You spoke about how did we get here, and I think my colleague spoke about the commodity crash, which started happening about 2 years ago. Nigeria, of course, is completely commodity dependent from oil, basically. But I think two other things were largely instrumental in the decline that we've seen in Nigeria. One is just, along with the commodity crash, there was also militant activities with the pipelines in Nigeria, which dramatically reduced the oil production and therefore revenues to the federal government. And 90% of the federal government's revenues of foreign exchange comes from oil. So that was a massive hit to the government. And the second is just a failure of the previous administration, I believe, to diversify the Nigerian economy. And so we were, largely a consumption-driven economy and an elite consumption-driven economy. I think the one stat that was pretty interesting for me was that there's more champagne drunk in Nigeria than every other country in the world aside from two. So that's the third highest consumption, champagne drinking. That should not be a stat that we're proud of, but that's the sort of economy and the market that we had. So once that sort of disappeared, the party was over. I think we've had cold water thrown on our heads, and now we're waking up. And I think what's exciting for me as an investor today is that the worst is over. I believe, we're turning a corner. Yes, growth rates this year are predicted to be roughly about 1%, but that's far better than the recession we were in last year. So I think the future bodes extremely well, and I'd be glad to speak more about that as we go along.
And why do you say the worst is over? What are the signs?
If you look at the stats, first of all, the GDP is going to be positive versus last year negative. I think if you look at various sectors, the agricultural sector is growing, manufacturing is growing right now. We had a large foreign exchange issue where there was a lot of backlog with dollar demand from both foreign investors wanting to take the money out of Nigeria, also local manufacturing companies are trying to access foreign exchange to buy raw materials, to buy equipment. Most of that has been cleared in the last few weeks. I think our foreign exchange markets are gradually liberalizing, and that's great. So I think, the government has come out with a Growth and Recovery Act and plan, which has been pretty well received. I think the detail lies in the implementation of it, but I think the plan is really visionary, it's bold, and I do believe that politically there is a lot of cohesion within the government right now, at least more so than in the past. I mean, there's always going to be issues in any economy, but there is cohesion, there's a strong team, economic team, working on moving the country forward.
Thanks, Siki, and it is indeed a pleasure for me to be here. Let me start with the question you asked, Kuseni, why should we care? In this instance, size does matter. If you look at the size of these economies, this is where those investors, particularly when we are global, would want to invest. In Nigeria, it's not only the size of the economy, but it's the population as well. But also in South Africa, it's the size. So I think that's the first thing why we should talk about this. Now, why are we here? I think for me, it's the pace in which we've really tried to drive intra-Africa trade. We've relied largely on Europe and America, on the West, and then to at a later stage to Asia, predominantly China. So when those economies have been slowing down for various reasons, we've been affected. Had we maybe picked up the pace, because we've spoken about what should be done, but the implementation for me has not been at the level where it is. If you look at the resources, the continent as a whole has lots of resources. If you look at opportunities in agriculture, it's massive. But if you look at our yields as a continent, if you take South Africa aside, I mean, the yields are very low, and where there's an opportunity. But if you look at also manufactured goods, and that's very low. So I think those are the areas in which, in terms of our policies, but it's largely in terms of the implementation. Yeah. As we know about this, I mean, there's Africa 2063, which provides hope, where we should be going as a continent, but the implementation for me has not been at the pace where we should be.
Let's talk about that, because Danladi talked about Nigeria's growth plan. We've got in South Africa the National Development Plan. So we're not short of plans, and we come up with really good plans, but why does implementation fail? Can we point at a culprit for that?
Well, I wouldn't say we should point at a culprit. I think we all are jointly responsible, be it business, private sector, and public sector. But I think one thing, there needs to be predictability in the policies. That's one. So we can have a plan, but if you have a plan, then you have to stick to the plan. So the plans are good, as you say, but sometimes when times are tough, then we don't make those tough decisions to say, this is the path that we've chosen, then we should go with it. I think that's from the government side. But also now, when we look at businesses within the local countries, I mean, we should really be backing our own economies. And I think there's an opportunity to do that, but I don't think we're getting it to that same extent. IDC invests in a number of countries, in South Africa and outside of South Africa. And we see that there's lots of opportunities. But what we have not done is, all of us, is investing in infrastructure. There's been good plans. There's the African Development Bank, which is putting in resources on energy, for an example. But that's taken just too long. So I wouldn't say there's one culprit, but it's all of us. But for me, the basic thing is, if governments have got those plans, when tough decisions have to be made, we have to make and stick with those decisions.
Kuseni, what do you think about that?
I think Jeff is making a very important point. On the issue of why plans fail, it's a very famous and topical question which we must ask often enough and emphatic enough. I'd like to suggest that the plans fail because we don't have a coordinated implementation mechanism. We tend to think once the government announces a plan, it's all done. I would like to suggest that we need to make sure that the private sector, the labor sector, civil society, communities are mobilized to engage with the aspects of the plans that relate to them directly. If we take the example of the National Development Plan in South Africa, for example, my company, Massmart, we've gone through it paragraph by paragraph. When we formulate our business strategy, we look at those aspects that we can impact and influence. We set targets, we monitor our performance, we report on how we perform on those targets, and I think if we can do that not just as one company, but as a country and as a region, across Africa, we can be able to really achieve more progress. I mean, on the issue around integration that Jeff mentioned, I can agree with him more. Africa is the only continent in the world that trades the least with itself. Only 10% of trade is intra-African on the continent. If we can set a target for the next 10 years to just double that to 20%, we can be in a position to make inroads to reversing the frontiers of poverty, creating more decent jobs, and industrializing our economies. We remain very optimistic about prospects in Africa. We invest in Nigeria. We are looking at opening more stores there. To your point, to the point that Danladi was making, that the worst is over. When we look at the environment there, we were very encouraged that in the medium to long term, it's a place in which to invest. It's a place in which we've got to look at growth. It is about numbers in retail, and Nigeria has the numbers, and you can't ignore that. You have to be there if you want to win in African retail.
Can we say that the worst is over in South Africa, given that 2 of the 3 major ratings agencies have just recently junked us?
That's a good point. I think we need to look beyond the downgrades in South Africa and start having a conversation about an investment grade recovery plan that requires vigor that is double what the CEO initiative and government have been driving together. We have a lot of examples of countries that have been through this. Some have managed to get out of it quicker than others, and let's benchmark ourselves and look at international best practice experiences that we can emulate and be able to get out of it. I think the fundamentals in terms of our economy are very sound. There is policy certainty in South Africa. There is stability. We're going through a period of noise on the political side. The noise will be there maybe for the next 18 months or so, but beyond that, we've got strong institutions, strong parties across the political landscape, to the point that I think also in Nigeria as well, the politics is coming back quite nicely. There's more stability. There's a new plan that the Nigerian government has announced. I think by and large, we can be able to pull ourselves up and get back to investment grade.
I hope so. Haruki, I saw you nodding when we were talking about intra-Africa trade and the need to strengthen that. So you'd agree with that point that we need to do a lot more work in us trading with each other?
Reason why I mentioned that is because unless you have a capacity building within the continent, Nigeria or the South Africa, you continue to import things from outside, which is not helping anybody. To enhance the capability to produce its own goods and serve its own people is probably the most important part. And that is going to show some confidence to the overseas investors. that we're dealing with a local partner. So that helps us to partner with the local partners who are on a different scale. So I think what we need is really a clarity over the policy continuation, stability, and also probably a little bit more collaboration between two countries against the other rest of the world.
Yeah. And in the current climate, where globally countries are looking inward, there's a lot of talk about protectionism. There's a lot of talk, anti-globalization talk. I wonder how that might affect the recovery of both South Africa and Nigeria. People are looking inward. They're saying, let's keep our jobs local. So the tide has turned from the time when we're talking about Africa rising. How are investors making those decisions now in this climate?
I was on a similar panel, much smaller by the way, in Davos in January, and I was the only Asian on the panel. But I said to everybody, I come from London, where we were scared about the terrorisms, scared about Brexit, scared about the continuing turnout of the election in Europe. Africa is much more stable. So this is something, a good news you have. And you have to really convince the rest of the continent. So you are, although not as high in terms of growth rate as you enjoyed in the past, but still thriving a lot faster than any other part of the world. So you need to put the good story in front.
Are we good at that, at marketing ourselves?
No, I don't think we are. Not at all. And you're entirely right. We need to do far more. I spoke early on about sort of Nigeria turning the corner. I think there's lots of like quick wins that have occurred even recently. And when you speak about sort of what makes a difference in actually implementing a plan, I think it's just the team and the team's focus and their drive. So one very quick win was our oil production has gone up from 1.2 million barrels per day to about over 2 million barrels per day. That's a massive difference in terms of our government's revenues. And what happened? The team just went down to the Niger Delta and actually spoke to the militants, right? Very quick win. It's much easier to do that than to industrialize, which takes many more years. But these are some of the things that are being done that gives us confidence in this economy. You talk about sort of the security situation as well. I'm glad you spoke about being afraid of terrorism in parts of Europe, right? I remember when WEF was in Abuja 4 years ago. Abuja was on lockdown, literally, right? Everyone's really concerned about security. Now, you hear about Boko Haram, but it's still isolated to the northeastern parts of the country, and there will always be, events that we're not proud of and not happy with, but largely the country has been made a lot more secure in the last 18 months. We speak about corruption, which is always the elephant in the room. There have been a lot of anti-corruption initiatives in Nigeria, and I think those have largely been quite successful. And I think we don't speak enough about them. Unfortunately, the headline news always speaks about sort of the amounts of capital that was recovered, but the fact that money has been recovered should be celebrated. It's good news. It's showing that there is progress being made, and I think the world needs to hear more of that and the positive side of things. I think that will lead to the flow of capital and growth.
And just sticking with that theme of making ourselves investor-friendly and attractive.
Well, Siki, you spoke about protectionism, people looking internally. I think for me that gives us a good opportunity as a continent, as Ruki has said here. When those that saying we're closing our economies, let's use that to focus and develop the African continent, that's one. We're in a global village, I think we know that. In fact, when we're in Davos and listening to the president of China, I was actually quite encouraged because he was actually embracing globalization. So there are those big powers, big economies that still embrace it. So we should be looking at those. But for me, that provides an opportunity. So when people close, but also the issue I think you asked, I mean, are we marketing ourselves well? I don't think we are. I think we tend to be too harsh on ourselves and focus largely on the negatives. The downgrade, as you spoke about, it's not going to be easy. I don't think we should underplay that. But that should provide us an opportunity. I think if you look particularly in South Africa, the business has engaged with the president of the country, which is a good sign to say what should we be doing. And I think that for me gives hope. Because what has happened is before the downgrades, there was a lot of cooperation between business and government, and I don't think we should lose sight of that. Now that we've been downgraded as a country, let's use that to work even much more harder, because as we all know, I mean, there are those sources of income which will not go to countries which have been downgraded, and that provides an opportunity to us to say, what role should we play jointly? We cannot leave that just to one party. But we have to engage robustly and frankly, and once we've done that, then we can iron out those, and then we can really indeed promote our country. Because our countries have got lots of opportunities, as I said. I mean, for me, I suppose everyone has got a pet. For me, agriculture is. Yeah. We've got the land, and we've got the climate, and I think we should use that.
Are you investing in agriculture?
Yes, absolutely. As the IDC, we are investing. We're investing in agro-processing. Because what I've learned is whether you're rich or poor, you are going to eat something.
Certainly. All right, we're going to take some questions from the floor. I'd just like you to identify yourself and also who your question is directed at. Any questions? There's one there. And if I could ask you to stand as well, please. Yes, please.
My name is Justin Brown. I'm a journalist with City Press. Just would like to ask a question about the investment grade recovery plan that Kuseni was talking about, and anyone else who might want to respond to that. But what is it going to take for South Africa to get back to investment grade, and what needs to be done to achieve that? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take another one before we respond. Another question? I'm a bit short-sighted, so this might take a while. All right, let's respond to this one while everybody thinks of the next one. Kuseni?
Thanks, Justin. That's a great question indeed. I think the first thing that is required is just for us to read the reports that the rating agencies have put out on South Africa. They do spell out the reasons why they've taken the views that they have on us. We need to read them line by line, and then on the basis of that, develop responsive and responsible programs of action that are going to help in addressing those issues. You need to do it at a technical level, but beyond that, the second aspect, which I think is more important, is really leadership. We need to show visible and felt leadership at a national level that we are committed to doing the right things on a sustained basis to lay the foundations for a globally competitive economy, for an economy that can attract and retain foreign direct investors, and also for an economy that can actually give incentives to local investors. Let's not forget, we need to mobilize the capacity of local investors to build globally competitive companies that can play not just in South Africa and Africa, but globally as well. But it will really take us taking a pause, and realizing the mistakes that we've committed to get to where we are, and being very serious about doing what it takes to correct those mistakes.
Ahead of the downgrade, there was, as Geoffrey mentioned, lots of collaboration between the social partners, business, labor, and government. And one gets the sense that maybe that's come off now a little bit. We're starting to hear the trust deficit statements start to pull up again. Do you get the sense that there's work being done to rebuild that trust?
That's a good point, Siki. I get a sense that, to Jeff's point, last week there was a conversation that took place between business leaders and the president, and the new finance minister has been doing a great job in reassuring the business community, not just in South Africa, but globally. He'll be speaking for himself later on in this place. He was in New York and Washington, D.C. and Boston recently. I think there is an attempt from the business circles that I'm part of. I'm getting a sense that people are willing to re-engage and reconnect, and I'm also getting a sense that our leaders also also are looking forward to try and do the right things to be able to get us back to investment grade.
Maybe just also to respond to Justin's question. For me, the two things I picked up was lack of growth and policy certainty. So on policy certainty, I think it is the purview of government, and I think it's important that government continues to engage and to reassure that those changes that have been made, surprising to some of them, that will not impact negatively on the policy. So that will give a sense. So that then this engagement where the different parties, government, labor, and business, can then play their part in ensuring that all of us work together in ensuring that there is growth. I mean, last year as a country we grew by 0.3%. That's very low. As you said, and this year the production, we estimated that we'll grow by 1%. And being one of the large economies in the continent, we need to grow a little bit more. Now, when we've given that assurance that there's policy uncertainty and that it will not be disrupted by these changes, then the other players will need to come into the party as well to say, at the back of that, indeed, we are going to invest. Because we have to invest, I mean, we still have to invest a lot of money on the infrastructure, about $1 trillion of infrastructure. Yeah. That will unlock a lot of opportunities. But also, if you look in terms of the government procurement, there's lots of opportunities in terms of allowing small and medium-sized and localization opportunities, and those could be done. So at the back of ensuring that there is that policy uncertainty. So that collaboration is very important, and I think we shouldn't underestimate the power of that and how because we've missed about 2 downgrades and it was because of that collaboration, and we need to keep that momentum.
All right. I want to stick with the growth question, Danladi, and just come to Nigeria. I mentioned that the predictions are from the IMF that you're going to grow at 0.8%. You mentioned oil, but we keep coming back to the issue of diversification. Does the new plan speak quite strongly about that to ensure that you don't stick with the over-reliance on oil revenues?
Yes, absolutely it does. I think, as you mentioned, yes, we're completely reliant on oil. So oil is definitely the petrol, the engine of growth of the economy. And I think the phrase I've heard is they're trying to move it towards being the lubricant for the overall economy, right? So not necessarily the source of power, but to ensure everything else just works. And so this new plan really focuses on other sectors, including agriculture, manufacturing, ICT, particularly sectors that can lead to a lot of employment, right, and sustainable employment. I mean, we have, 190 million people, as was mentioned. Apparently our population grew by 30% in the last decade alone. Those are scary facts. So you have to employ all these people. So you need to look for sort of sectors, and the oil sector hardly employs anyone. So I think there's just a massive focus in these other sectors, and they're doing things both fiscally wise and also based on monetary policy to try and encourage growth in these other sectors, which I think is what we need.
And you'd agree we need growth in order to fuel these two economies forward?
Yeah, I think the point that I made in the beginning is why the two nations can be a leader and driver is the existence of the large, proven companies in both two countries, which is actually serving across the continent very well. And they can be a role model for the international investors to feel more comfortable to work together. I'm setting the government aside for purpose, but I think the role of the private sector in two countries can do a lot to attract the foreign investors to the country because of the success. But then we need a little bit of transparency and also the sustainability and in a way that the policy is implemented, especially the industrial policies.
Yeah, all right. We'll take another question. There's one there. Please keep your hand up so you can see. Thank you.
Thanks, Siki. My name is Kizito from Sea Africa, Nigeria, South Africa. And my question to the panelists is, do you think the two big economies have the appetite or the capability to actually create new businesses? Because I think what we need now is to create a new economy that will create more jobs, especially in the small and medium enterprises. because I don't see much support that is going. We're always talking of the big businesses and so on. But I believe that more jobs will actually come from the small and medium enterprises and also the startups that are developing new ideas and so on, but are not getting the seed capital to take their ideas or to scale it to the next level.
Thank you. Kuseni, I'll start with you.
Kizito, that's a very important question. I'd like to say that it touches on the challenge that faces the two countries at a high level. We have not seen visible and felt leadership that is proactive in seeking to create business-to-business relationships between the two countries. But the private sector of both countries, we've got the Dangote Group investing in South Africa. We've got a number of South African companies invested in Nigeria. I think the private sector has done a lot. I think it can help if there could be more coordination at the highest level in terms of allowing the big companies to do more business with each other. But to your point around small and medium enterprises, but also having specific and targeted initiatives to try and create small and medium enterprises in both countries. As a retailer, we invest a lot in making sure that we source goods locally, and in markets where we don't have local suppliers, we go out to look for them, and where they don't exist and there's potential to develop them, we invest in developing them. We have the Supplier Development Fund within Massmart. We have succeeded in supporting a number of small and medium enterprises who are suppliers to our stores. But that will not solve Africa's problems. It will not solve even South Africa or Nigeria's problems. But we need scalable, systemic interventions across the continent to be able to unlock the potential of African economies to trade with each other, to integrate and invest within the African economic bloc.
His first question was, do we have the appetite?
Yeah, I think the private sector is showing that it has the appetite. It can get things done, and things are happening. And my direct response to that is that that's an area of opportunity where we've got to demonstrate that we have the appetite, we have the hunger, we have the willingness to be proactive. Because if we leave things to chance, we may achieve progress, but it's likely to be smaller progress, maybe slower progress. But if we are proactive, deliberate, focused, setting very clear targets, having clear working plans, maybe we can achieve more sooner and better.
Thank you. I think that's a great question, and I think there's certainly a lot of appetite. I think, as you said, I mean, the real engine of growth, I think, in the economy is the small and medium-sized businesses, right? So the large businesses always get lots of the attention, and that's good. But I think that the growth really happened with the small businesses. And if I sort of look at what the government is trying to do here, you know, there's a lot of work done on sort of the ease of doing business. So I think today Nigeria ranks 169 on that list. The government is trying to move that to 100. I think that will be dramatically impactful for small businesses trying to get established. Just working on infrastructure as well, working on education, and then just access to credit. So there are lots of initiatives as well to give access to credit to these small businesses. I think all of these initiatives really bode well for these small businesses, because we know we have a very large entrepreneurial workforce. Right, so it's about sort of getting these guys into businesses and giving them the right environment to actually grow their businesses. Now, I know some of the larger companies, the multinationals, for instance, are working very hard on also trying to stimulate the small businesses and integrating them into their value chains, which is great for them. But I do think that's a major focus of government, and I think the government is aware of that, but also private investors. And I think as sort of that ecosystem develops more, we will see more and more investors coming in supporting smaller businesses. Today, lots of the capital coming into Nigeria, for instance, target larger businesses. So investors come into the country, want to write $50, $100 million checks, because frankly, those are sort of easier businesses to back. But I think, you know, the real challenge is how do we get these guys to begin to invest in the micro businesses and the medium-sized businesses and provide true growth equity and growth capital, because that's what will make the big difference in the future.
Let me speak from the South African perspective. If I look at what the government has done, firstly, there's been the creation of the Ministry of Small Business Development. For me, that's an indication to saying there is a focus on ensuring that how do we assist small and medium-sized enterprises. Also, if you look at the initiatives by the Department of Trade and Industry, where there's a one-stop shop to try and really unlock and make it easier for business, and particularly the small business, the small and medium-sized businesses. I think that's an indication for me that it is indeed appetite. When you look at the Jobs Fund, there's something that we call the Jobs Fund, which the Development Bank of South Africa is running on behalf of National Treasury. That also, the grant element really helps to unlock and really encourage small business, small and medium-sized enterprises. That, together with a number of other incentives that the Department of Trade and Industry have. So those one part. One part which I think we as a country can do more is on localization. As I mentioned, that there's a lot of money on earmarked for infrastructure, and also if we look at the back of the renewable energy projects that we had, we did not localize to the extent that we could have. But now also when I look at the role that ourselves as IDC play, I mean, ourselves now, we have a small enterprise finance agency, which is wholly owned by us. We've capitalized that, and we've really give it a boost so that it really supports small and medium-sized enterprise. Also the collaboration we have with the National Youth Development Agency. So in terms of the appetite, I think there is appetite. I think there is recognition, indeed, that the small and medium-sized enterprises, those are the ones that we should be backing, because rent for rent, they create more jobs than the big ones.
I'll get a comment from Haruki, and then we'll take more questions.
I think from outside investors, what we need most is long-term gain rather than short-term gain. Two countries are very much enriched by natural resources, so fluctuation of the commodity price would hit tomorrow, and you have a short-term gain. Yeah. But if the short-term gain can be spent for the long-term win, I think there will be a lot of investors want to flow in to work together. But unfortunately, the reality is not quite the same. So that would be my message. Appetite is there.
Okay. There was a question down there. I'll come to you now.
Thank you. I'd like to raise the issue of cities. I'm surprised that on a continent that is rapidly urbanizing, South Africa is a country that's about 65% urbanizing and growing, that Mr. Qhena wants to talk with enthusiasm about agriculture, which is 2% of the GDP. But in overall, I think the panel needs to think about the where of growth. So most economists talk about national growth, but they don't think about where it's going to take place. And we know it's going to take place in the cities. And that's where we're going to have to talk about infrastructure and much greater investment and, frankly, a sense of urgency about what needs to be done. And if you're interested in successful businesses, large, small, medium-sized, and growing, we need to also move beyond the rhetoric to what is the business environment that we need, what is the ecosystem we need, mainly in our cities, for those to prosper and for new firms to emerge. And the fact is that in South Africa, the number of small businesses is declining as the rhetoric about our great support for it goes up. So I really want to throw at the panel a much greater emphasis and their opinions about cities, and the arenas of growth are going to mainly be in urban areas in the subcontinent and certainly in South Africa, and how are they seeing that?
Thanks, Anne. There's a question here. Have you got a microphone? Okay.
Hello. My name is Chinwe Ajanesani. I work with JLL. And I have a question concerning a consistent theme that I think you all agree to, which I wholeheartedly agree with, which is the idea of encouraging cross-regional trade, as a solution. And I was at the WEF last year and participated in a number of sessions where they talked about the successes, particularly, I guess, in the southern area. But there weren't many examples, practical examples in West Africa. So I'm curious to know that, yes, we agree that this should happen, but practically, what is being done? And are you involved in such steps? And if not, maybe theoretically then, what would you recommend as a solution to this issue?
Thank you. And there's a question here, please. You're taking notes, right?
Thank you. My name is Malusi Peza. I work for Gilead Sciences and within the Sub-Saharan space. And I just want to pose a slightly peculiar question as we discuss potential economic growth and boosting that within our region, particularly within these two economic hubs focusing on South Africa and Nigeria. As part of economic growth, we essentially have to look at our greatest source of resource, both from a poor base but also from a highly functioning base, and that's largely around human capital, which we rely on to ensure economic growth. From a top-tier perspective in the region, I feel we're fairly catered for in the sense that the funded community, whether it's through medical aids or through self-funding, the base of the pyramid is often well taken care of through state-based programs. We have a huge plague of brain drain, particularly within the middle class. And for those that do remain in their various countries, should we not be looking at innovative healthcare financing solutions to facilitate and ensure that these individuals remain healthy, whether within work-based employment programs, but also microfinance mechanisms overall, so that we can ensure that our greatest source of economic growth is essentially maintained and sustained into the long term. Thanks.
Thank you. I'll start with you.
Yes. Let me first respond to I think it's N on cities. Cities are very important. One cannot underestimate that. But also there's a reality that you have space issues. So not everyone in the whole country can be in a city. That's impossible. That's just physically impossible. So now what one has to do is to say, what other infrastructure do you put in place? What other economic activity happens outside of the cities? And that's one thing that I think we should also be focusing on. As much as cities are key, they play a role in terms of development, but not necessarily everybody. We've got a lot of people who are in rural areas which will not be. So now if you only focus on cities, what do you do to those? Do you ignore those or do you forget those? For me, that's one area that I think when we invest as the IDC, not only do we look at the sectors, but we look at where the investments are. And then also see what opportunities can we bring closer to those people. Because what you also want to try and avoid is to reduce the thoughts or the tendencies that people, when they think they go into the cities, now all their problems are resolved. Because then we see how those cities have actually been able to sustain themselves. Now, on the issue of what are we doing on the regional integration. In fact, ourselves as IDC, we're investing in infrastructure because that's one part, at least from our side, where we're seeing that once you invest in infrastructure, be it energy, be it roads, you unlock a lot of opportunities because there will be people who would be, if it's in terms of roads, who would be having agricultural products, but now they don't have access to those markets. And once you have that infrastructure, that unlocks that. I mean, there was one simple example that we did. We invested in the DRC, in the Katanga province, where all they did was just to build roads. And that economy has changed, and I think we can learn from that. And the point on Malusi on really ensuring that those that are on the lower part, I think it's important. It is important that we do not forget those. So one has to say, how do we make sure that they have access to medical health as an opportunity? For an example, we're looking at telemedicine as one of that. So where we know sometimes it's going to be difficult to send medical doctors there, but how do you use that as just but one example? But I think your observation is indeed, because that's the source of ensuring that we grow. I mean, those people, also the education part of that. I mean, because as we talk about the fourth industrial revolution, the type of employees that are needed are the ones that will be able to respond.
Thanks. If I just echo my colleague's comments, in terms of cross-regional trade, I mean, I think the most important thing is just transportation, frankly. You know, if you look at the ECOWAS region, yes, you know, there's supposed to be free movement of goods and services and also people across the region. But if you just don't have the road and the road networks and infrastructure, then that trade is just not going to happen. And I think that's what needs to happen first. I think there's lots of great rhetoric and lots of good initiatives, but without infrastructure, it can't happen. I mean, and I think of, you know, even as we're thinking of regional trade, even just domestic consumption, domestic consumption, there's tons of opportunities with domestic consumptions that are hampered by the lack of that infrastructure. So I think one fact that came up is that 30% of the fruits grown in the middle parts of Nigeria rot because they cannot get to the destination, even within Nigeria. So, you know, we're not even talking regional trade, we're talking about like within the country itself, there are infrastructural deficits that need to be met. In terms of the brain drain, I think that's a very important topic. I think the most important thing, though, is to create jobs, right? So if you create jobs, then people stay, people have gainful employment. If people have the right healthcare, the right education, you know, they will stay in the countries. So I look at India as a great example, right? So India had, you know, a massive sort of migration of talent out of India. India had very good education institutions, the IITs. That trained a lot of people who left the country, started companies, Silicon Valley, elsewhere, and eventually these guys are all trickling back to the benefit of the Indian economy. So I think the key thing is just, you know, growth in your economy, jobs, focus on small businesses, and you know, your talent will remain because there are opportunities for your talent. Talent just follows opportunity.
Right. I think everybody's questions is pretty much not just related to two countries, but entire Africa. And Africa is a continent of 12 billion people with 54 countries. Some of the observation of success in Asia is because they are treated as single countries, not Asia. And I think this uniqueness of each individual country's expression will make Africa even more attractive. I think that is branding Africa is perhaps a little bit obsessed with the continent, but I think if you try to impress the other side of the continents about the uniqueness of each of the countries, and each of the country can have a different talents and different expressions. I think these things will really make this regional integration, because no one has to be the winners for everything. You have some strengths and weaknesses. You should complement each other, and these things probably will help.
I would like to echo what my colleagues have said. Just to add to Anne's question on cities, I think that's a very key one. Most economies around the world that revolve around cities, whether you look at the UK economy, London looms large, you look at Germany, you look at other countries as well. I think what we need to appreciate in Africa is really to look at how do we make our cities globally competitive? How do we make sure that we create an enabling environment for investors to invest in those cities so that they can compete not just with each other, but with the world-class cities. If we look at Nairobi, can we turn Nairobi into a Silicon Valley of some kind? Some call it a Savannah Valley of sorts. If you look at South Africa, can we create a global financial services hub in this country? According to the World Economic Forum, we are in the top 4 in the world in terms of the efficacy of our financial services. Look at Lagos. Can we create an agribusiness hub there, oil and gas hub in that environment? So I think it's that kind of thinking and that is required. What we are doing as an investor on the continent, we started in first-tier cities, now we're going into second-tier cities. To Jeff's point, you can't just look at the big cities. You need to look at the smaller cities as well. And of course, also look at integrating the rural areas into your value chain. We go beyond the cities, look at farmers in rural areas, integrate them into our value chain. And coming to the second question on regional integration, what we are doing concretely, we're developing regional supply chains. We're having regional approaches to how we conduct logistics. We are developing sources of supply in different parts of the regions where we operate on the continent, and also more importantly as well, Siki, on the issue of talent, we invest immensely in training locals. You go to our stores in Mozambique, Zambia, they're 100% run by locals, managers and staff. And also look at our food section, you go to Zambia, to our game store, 100% of the food you'll find there will be from Zambian farmers. So that's something that we do deliberately, and we believe businesses can do that. Mulisi, your question, I think Jeff has answered it very well, and I fully agree with what he said on that. Yeah.
All right, we are almost out of time, so just in wrapping up, I think we've reached some consensus on the importance of the two economies. We can't afford to have them fail. I think there's an agreement that we need a lot more work on ensuring that there's policy certainty, that everybody's working together, pulling together towards a common goal. I think some ideas have come through from the audience as well on areas where we need to focus on. So I'm going to give each of you about 30 seconds just to wrap up for us a way forward what your hopes are for these two economies. When we meet again here next year, we want to hear what would you like to have seen have happened? I'll start with you.
I'd like to close off by saying that the reversal of the globalization projects presents opportunities and challenges. I think there are more opportunities for Nigeria and South Africa to leverage than challenges. We need to work that much closer together. We need to be joined up. We need to be integrated. We need to be strategic. And maybe we need to add to President Xi Jinping's voice in being champions, the new champions of globalization. We still need an open world economy so that we can export our goods, so that we can be able to trade. I would like to say that if Nigeria and South Africa cooperate and collaborate, the challenges facing Africa are going to be a thing of the past, and we will be a first world continent within a generation, as indeed I think we can and must.
Thank you. Your final word?
Yes. Something that I haven't covered is the fact that you have no aging population in Africa, and you have probably vested with excitement of involving your nationals in building this new continent and new economy, which would run completely different style from the rest of, for example, Asia, what Asia had to go through. With the IoT and renewables and value add, I think the 54 countries in Africa can actually take each merit, but then it needs the two nations as the role models. So perhaps the two nations needs to take time, and rather than shorter game, but the long-term game will benefit for the both countries and also the rest of the 54 countries in the continent.
Thank you.
Thanks. I think what I'd like to see is us being a bit more positive. There's good in Africa, particularly relative to the rest of the world. You know, every region has its own issues. We have our own issues. It's good for us to be unsatisfied. That keeps us hungry. That keeps us moving and keeps us demanding more, holding our government to be more accountable. But at the same time, there are positives, and I think we need to remain positive, continue investing, continue supporting small and medium-sized businesses, and you know, come back with success stories in the future.
Thanks, Siki. For me, I'm an optimist by nature. So I would say these two economies, they are binationals at presidential level. For me, that shows how high that relationship has been elevated. We have a young continent. We've got the resources. We've got great policies. I think what we need to do is to implement. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A round of applause, please. Thank you for your participation and attention. Enjoy the day.